D.E. Cordigaler, my name is James Nagle, welcome to The Irish Nation Lives. For almost 2 weeks in April of 1919, Limerick City was governed by a workers' council, which had its own police force and issued its own currency. To understand what led to the birth of the Limerick Soviet, we need to go back to December of 1918. On New Year's Eve, the RIC raided the home of Robert Byrne. A member of the Irish Volunteers, in November Byrne had been elected adjutant of the 2nd Battalion, which covered Limerick City. He had been sacked from his position as a telegraph operator by the Limerick GPO because of his involvement with the trade union movement, and had been on the RIC's watch list since he attended the funeral of John Daly in 1916, an uncle of Kathleen Clark. At his house, an unloaded revolver was discovered, along with ammunition and a pair of field binoculars. He was arrested, and at his trial he refused to recognise the authority of the court and was sentenced to 12 months hard labour. At Limerick Prison on the 5th of February, Byrne led 16 prisoners in a demand for political status. They barricaded themselves into their cells, smashed furniture, and sang rebel songs so loudly that they could be heard from the streets outside. The protest was put down by baton charge, and the prisoners were shackled to their beds in solitary confinement. In response to this, they went on hunger strike. After 3 weeks, Byrne's health had deteriorated to such a degree that he was transferred under heavy armed guard to the Union Workhouse Hospital. East Tipperary TD Pierce McCann had died in prison due to the Spanish flu a week earlier, and authorities didn't want any more deaths, causing further bad press. Though under 24-hour armed guard, Byrne was kept in a public ward with other patients. This provided the volunteers with a chance to free him, and on Sunday the 6th of April, 20 volunteers entered the hospital, posing as visitors, under the command of Michael Stack. When all were in place, Stack blew his whistle and volunteers rushed to grab hold of Byrne, but one of his guards, Constable James Spillane, drew his pistol and shot him in the chest at point-blank range. They pulled Byrne free and made their escape after overwhelming the rest of the guard. Byrne was taken by horse and cart to a house just outside the city, over the Clare border. Already weak from the hunger strike, Robert Byrne died from his injury at 8:30 in the evening. On the 10th of April, Byrne's remains were carried from St. John's Cathedral to Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery, bringing the city to a standstill. Businesses closed as a mark of respect. A crowd of over 10,000 lined the streets, and a group of British soldiers even stood to attention and saluted the coffin. Their superiors, however, were less respectful. The escape attempt had rattled them, and Limerick was proclaimed a special military area under the Defence of the Realms Act. Barricades, manned by soldiers and tanks, were set up to block all routes into and out of the military area, which didn't include the working-class residents of Thomondgate. They would need to pass the barricades 4 times a day to get to and from work, and for this they would need a military permit, issued in person by Brigadier General C.J. Griffin. On the 13th of April, the Limerick Trades and Labour Council met at the Mechanics' Institute, attended by 35 trade unions, and issued the following proclamation. The workers of Limerick assembled in council hereby declare cessation of all work from 5 a.m. on Monday, April 14th, 1919, as a protest against the decision of the British government in compelling them to procure permits in order to earn their daily bread. By order of the Strike Committee, Mechanics' Institute. The next morning, 15,000 workers joined the strike. The Limerick Soviet had begun. Depots were set up within the city to supply food at fixed prices, and labour was provided for essential industries, such as bakeries and the gas and electric works. Opening and closing times of shops were regulated, and all public houses were closed for the duration of the strike. The Soviets' diktats were enforced by a civilian police force, and any company engaged in profiteering was closed down. Outside the city, the Irish Volunteers gathered food and other supplies from the surrounding countryside and smuggled them across the River Shannon by boat at night. Funeral hearses entered the military area from the Union Workhouse, and more often than not, contained supplies instead of bodies. The Soviet benefited massively from the teams of international journalists who had gathered to report on an attempted transatlantic flight. Major J.C.P. Wood was expected to refuel at the city on his way to Newfoundland, but when news came in that he had ditched his plane off the coast of Wales, the media turned its attention to the Soviet, with headlines appearing in the New York Times on the 15th. Brigadier General Griffin tried to ease tensions on the 17th by allowing members of the Limerick Chamber of Commerce to issue permits to their employees directly, but this was unacceptable to the strike committee. On the same day, Labour Party leader Thomas Johnson arrived to represent the Irish Trades Union Council, announcing that the full strength of the labour movement in Ireland, backed by the general public, would be exerted on behalf of the men and women of Limerick. The Irish Times was no friend of Irish nationalism or the plight of the Limerick strikers, but it was correct in its assessment that the strike is too big for a small city like Limerick, and it is bound to collapse unless substantial outside aid is forthcoming. The Irish Trade and General Workers Union contributed £1,000 to, as they put it, raise the siege of Limerick, and at a convention on the 20th of April, the GAA made a grant of £100 and began a series of matches to raise further funds. Practical help and support, however, was less forthcoming. A number of British trade unions, which covered workers in Ireland, came out in opposition to the strike. J.H. Thomas, MP and General Secretary of the National Union of Railwaymen, advised members of the union in Ireland not to take part, and the British Labour Party and Trades Union Council were similarly unsupportive. For all of his promises, Thomas Johnson could offer little more than verbal support. The Mechanics' Institute, the Soviet's headquarters, was calling for a national strike, but Johnson informed them that this couldn't be done without a special conference of the party and Congress. The Soviets' biggest victory occurred on the 21st of April. Following a hurling match at Kier Hardie, which was outside the special military area, up to 1,000 people paraded around a checkpoint but refused to show permits. In the evening, some of them rode across the Shannon, but most stayed at Thomond Gate, and an open-air concert was organised with Irish dancing and singing. The next morning they boarded a train for Limerick City at Long Pavement Station and managed to avoid a detachment of soldiers sent to check their permits, marching triumphantly from the terminus into the city. As time wore on though, cracks began to show in the Soviet regime. Many of the workers, especially those who didn't need permits, wanted to return to work. The Chamber of Commerce met on the 23rd to discuss using scab labour, and supply problems were becoming rife. Coal merchants, for example, had grown hostile to the strike and were refusing to open their yards. While money was being collected nationwide, it couldn't reach the city, and food supplies were also beginning to run low. A finance subcommittee was formed on the 14th to fund the Soviet, and with the help of Thomas Johnson, they designed and issued their own currency to solve the money problem, in denominations of 1, 5 and 10 shillings. But without a nationwide strike in support of the Soviet, it couldn't continue for much longer. On the 24th of April, the Bishop of Limerick, Dr. Denis Hallinan, and the Mayor, Adolphus O'Mara, met with the strike committee and negotiated an end to the Soviet. John Cronin, the chairman of the strike committee, issued a proclamation calling on all those who did not need permits to return to work the following day, but that those who did need permits should continue to refuse. Brigadier General Griffin agreed that if there was no trouble for a week, the barricades would be lifted, and thus the Soviet ended. Hallinan decided to act after hearing of a plan proposed by Thomas Johnson to evacuate the entire city and leave it as an empty shell in the hands of the military. Even though Johnson's suggestion was rejected by the strike committee, it demonstrated the limited options that were available to them and that nationwide support would not be coming. Although many felt that their sacrifices had been for nothing, the workers of Limerick could be proud that for 2 weeks they, alone, had taken a principled stand against British militarism. Treasurer and head of the Finance Subcommittee, James Casey, later wrote, "It was generally admitted that the city was never guarded or policed so well previously. The people, for once, were doing their own work, and doing it properly. There was no looting, and not a single case came up for hearing at the petty session." There was a small core of radical socialist thought in Ireland at this time. In February, for example, Peadar O'Donnell had declared a Soviet in County Monaghan, and at Byrne, the Irish Labour Party had supported a motion on the proletarian dictatorship, a tacit approval of the Soviet system in Russia, which was rejected by the conference overall. But these were only limited examples. While it would be wrong to brush the Limerick Soviet off as a marketing exercise, they weren't exactly adherents to the works of Marx or Lenin either. An American journalist, Ruth Russell, recounted red-badged guards of the civic police standing for the Angelus, and the mayor told her that there was no support for communism in the area, saying, "There can't be. The people here are Catholics." One church leader even told her that Ireland had had its own brand of socialism in the days of St. Patrick, and had nothing to fear from the Soviet. The Irish labour and trade union movements were undergoing a decoupling from the British movement and had achieved a major victory by gaining separate representation at Bern. Labour, especially though, displayed considerable weakness and a lack of unified purpose during the Limerick Soviet, as it had in the run-up to the 1918 general election. British trade unions with branches in Ireland were not going to come out against their own military, and the Soviet gained only what the Irish Times described as the injurious praise of the British Socialist Party and of the Independent Labour Party. Some of these problems were down to the workers' unilateral action in calling the strike without first discussing the matter with Labour so that better plans could be made. Sinn Féin also provided very little support for the Soviet. They didn't like the idea of Labour acting on its own initiative and viewed them as a tool to be used to achieve the successes of the wider national struggle. Strikes should be used to back Sinn Féin-led campaigns, such as the conscription crisis or the general strike called in April of 1920 in support of hunger strikers. In the face of severe adversity, the Limerick Soviet lasted for almost 2 weeks and stood down with a compromise which kept the majority of their pride intact. When the money collected nationwide was used to buy back the currency they issued, there was a surplus remaining, making the Soviet a financial success. Inspired by their efforts, numerous worker Soviets would spring up throughout the country in the years of turmoil ahead, but none would be on the same scale or achieve the same level of fame as the Limerick Soviet. Accordia, thank you for joining me on The Irish Nation Lives. Slán go fóill.